what I would like to talk about very briefly with you is the idea of good governance. Everybody loves good governance. It sounds like motherhood and apple pie. And if you remember the film, The Good, the Bad and the Ugly, it becomes very easy to find lots of bad governance. You might say Kim Jong-un of Korea perhaps is ugly, Putin of Russia is bad, maybe Obama is good. But when you ask the question, is Obama really good? People would say, what about all those missiles, the drones in Pakistan? What about the surveillance of people in America and abroad? So what is good becomes controversial. But the idea of good governance has been introduced to developing countries and transitional societies by international financial institutions such as the World Bank, the IMF, and Western donor countries. And underneath the idea is that there should be reforms in all these countries of matters such as the constitution, the legal system, the public service, the ending of corruption, etc. But at the same time, there has to be reforms in economic governance. That is, there has to be economic liberalization, which means liberalization of trade, finance, investment, intellectual property rights, etc. And this is the aspect that becomes very controversial. On the one hand, one can imagine that economic liberalization is significant for development. On the other hand, critics argue that economic liberalization is done not in the interests of the countries concerned, but the interests of global capital. Secondly, the good governance measures are being introduced in ways in which critics argue that they are bypassing the traditional institutions of government, such as parliament, etc. In theory, they involve consultation with people, etc. But in practice, what tends to happen is small coteries of civil servants work with international consultants to develop what ends up as good governance projects, for example, in the public poverty reduction strategy papers. So these are the two main critiques of governance. The third critique of good governance is that in principle, while it's supposed to promise greater involvement and participation of people, the NGOs, the public sector, private sector, etc., in ideas of how, for example, poverty can be reduced, in practice, there is a bypassing of these institutions, and in practice what is happening is there is very much control from above, international control of the very minutiae of projects which take place in the name of good governance. So these are the critiques. The question is, what can be done about it all? And there are three possible suggestions. The first suggestion is general reform of governance mechanisms, greater involvement, greater participation of people and organizations in these good governance projects. On the other hand, critics argue that this is not enough. For example, Stiglitz suggests that actually the very donor organizations which are involved in the good governance projects are themselves badly governed. They are undemocratic. So, for example, the IMF and the World Bank are undemocratic. Should they be reformed? But the second suggestion is by people such as Shivji and Santos, which call for popular or counter-hegemonic, subaltern, etc. activism. That ultimately good governance can only come when the people themselves get involved in the promotion of effective change, effective reform.